Hi, folks, and welcome back to the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, and we're going to have to do a short interlude before we get to the next story that I promised in the previous episode. We actually have a Star Wars newspaper strip we need to talk about first. This was from October 4th to November 19th, or 14th, pardon me, of 1982, and it is called Iceworld. You can find it in Classic Star Wars The Rebel Storm. We're still in this trade here, and it begins right here. On this page. So basically, the story is Luke has escaped from Arbris. The last we saw him was in The Return of Ben Kenobi, which was the last story in the newspaper strip. So his ship gets damaged, and so he's with the droids at this point. They crash land on this barren ice planet, and they're saved by this rider on a tauntaun. So once you realize that it's a tauntaun, and again, it's very recognizable by the art. You say in your mind, like, oh, this is Hoth. So he's saved by Frisia, or Freya. I pronounce it Frisia because there's a silent G in there, or J in there. So she is there with her father, Governor Torok, and her dad doesn't want to go with Luke because basically Luke is taken, is rescued, and he's basically like, hey, you guys could come back with me. Back to the Rebel Alliance. And so her dad wants nothing to do with that. So there are some spoilers here. So if you don't want to hear spoilers, I do think that you should read the story, and you can leave right now. Here are the spoilers. So turns out that Frisia and her dad, Torok, are actually human replica droids. And they were created so the droids could basically double for the real governor and his daughter, so they could defect to the rebellion. They're actually former Imperial, people, and so the droids would take their place so they could go and fight for the rebellion. They get Luke connected to the rebels ultimately, and then Han is able to go and pick him up. So Hoth is desolate at this point. The way that it's described and shown in here is it's very desolate. It's very barren. Now, of course, we see of course, later on in the expanded universe, as we see, Hoth is kind of a much bigger thing than it was here. A lot of people think that, oh, this is the first time Hoth has appeared in the expanded universe. It actually is not. We see it, especially most recently, we've seen it in the Old Republic MMO. It is a battleground. It is a planet that you go to in the game, and there's a lot of bases and operations. It's a big battle. So we see that. And then, of course, in the video game, which, of course, is secondary canon, in the video game Rebel Assault, we see Hoth during the time of the Battle of Yavin, so way before this. So it's kind of become like a major battlefield. And we also find out later that in the EU that Han actually knows about it. We find that out in the Star Wars 3D comics, which we'll get to much, much later. And so basically, though, it's kind of the rediscovery of Hoth, and kind of having the epiphany of maybe this would be an interesting idea to put our base here. So basically, it's a story about, we see more a story, or I guess more about Frisia and her dad in Shadowstalker, which is in the publishing world. It comes 15 years later. It ties into to this, and it ties into Shadows of the Empire. And it's in between Return of Ben Kenobi and the Power Gem. That would be where I'd put it chronologically. So yeah, the rebellion, as a whole, not just Han, the rebellion as a whole has learned about Hoth. And you see that, okay, it opens the door to them moving their base there. So is this an essential read? Absolutely it is. I think it definitely is. This is one of the newspaper strips I think you should definitely read. A lot of them in here are really good. So not so much the story, I guess, is why I would call it an essential read. The story's not bad. I want to make that clear that I think the story is very, very good. But it does open up the whole thing, like I've been saying, of how did the rebels go from Yavin to Hoth. And so that kind of sets up that whole period very, very well. So I do think it's an essential read for that. I do think it's not really a waste of your time. I think you'll definitely be entertained by the story in here. And I think definitely should check it out, but it's totally your call. Anyways, thank you so much for tuning in, folks, and I will see you next time with another episode of the Star Wars Library.